Hello, it's Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman with Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Ross McKenzie, who is a retired agronomy researcher who was with Alberta Agriculture when they had agronomy.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And today we're talking about soil salinity.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So, I want to outline the problem. I see it around Flagstaff County because of our subsoils. We have a lot of sodium salts in the soils, but how big is the problem?
Well, when we just look at dryland soil salinity, we've got, when we still have people working on it with Alberta Agriculture, we had about 1.6 million acres of dryland salinity. That's where you see the white salts on the soil surface.
Yeah.
Across, and mostly across southern and south central Alberta. But that's salinity. And then the other problem you mentioned is salinetic soils, which are basically sodic soils or high in sodium. Just off the top of my head, I can't give you a number, but it's in the millions of acres, right from the Alberta-Montana border all the way, basically along Highway 36 from Tabor, Hanna, Stettler, Vegreville, and even up in the Peace River country, there's a significant percentage of salinetic soils as well. So you can really kind of divide salinity or salt-affected soils into two groups. The saline soils, where you see the white salts on the soil surface,
right,
and then sodic soils, which are caused by high sodium, but they don't have white salt on the soil surface. So sodium actually gives a black sheen to soil. So They actually kind of look different. And so when I'm looking at a salinetic soil in the B horizon, often that columnar structured soil will almost have a black sheen to it. That's one of the ways to actually kind of identify, and that's caused by the sodium. So we really have two basic salt-affected soil types: dryland salinity and sodic soils. And there are times where you can actually have saline sodic soils. You actually have both. And that's kind of a worst case scenario.
Now, let's go back to grade 5 science. And why is salinity a problem?
Well, to be honest, we always had salinity on the prairies. If you go back to 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the last glaciation retreated, over that thousands of years, we actually had natural salinity to develop and form just through natural processes.
Right.
But there's a lot of the salinity we see across southern and central Alberta now, we call secondary salinity, which actually developed because of our farming practices. So if you go back to the 1900 to 1920, when we first started cultivating soils in Alberta, most farmers used the wheat fallow system. And so every other year they were fallowing. And so we had that excess water that was stored, but probably up to 70% of that excess water moved out of the root zone down into and formed groundwater. And so we developed a water table. And then between about 1900 and 1950, we had these areas with groundwater tables developing, and that groundwater would start to move down into lower slope positions. And when that water moves through the soil profile down to the groundwater, that excess water dissolves salts that just naturally occur in the soil. Then that salt would be transported with that groundwater. And then as that groundwater kind of pinched out in lower slope areas, for example, in coulee bottoms and low in slough areas that were lower lying relief areas in the field, you'd have that high water table that water would evaporate or be used by crops, and then the salt would be moving upwards as well into these low spots. The water get used up, the salts would be left behind, and so over 30 to 50 years of that groundwater movement transporting the salt into these lower areas, salts accumulated to the point where the areas became white and severely salt affected. If you back up, initially when that process started, a lot of the old timers, like I'm an old timer now, but the old timers I would talk to 30 and 40 years ago would say, those areas that are saline now, 30 years ago, they were the best growing or best productive areas in my field. They were lower, had more water, and they would produce the best. But then over time, they would tend to stay greener longer. Then over time, they would produce less and less just because the salt would accumulate just gradually increased. The concentration of the salt just gradually increased to the point where nothing would grow anymore. And once you see white on the soil surface, you've got a very strong salinity problem has developed to the point where the crops just don't even grow anymore.
Okay, so those once they get to the white crusty bits, it's almost too late, isn't it?
Well, then it's too late for crop production, but it's not too late to reclaim them. It's once you've identified where your salinity problems are, and Alberta Agriculture used to have a dryland salinity team that would actually work with farmers, and they would actually go out and use an instrument called an EM38. EM stands for electromagnetic, and they would usually electromagnetic resistance. They would actually be able to use that to map salinity in a farmer's field, develop a salinity map and a topography map, and then in the areas that they would identify as what we call the recharge areas, they would actually drill to see what depth is the water table at, where was the water table moving, and we actually the areas that are actually saline, we call them the discharge areas. That's where the water is being discharged. Yeah. But what we're really interested in is the recharge area. Where's that water coming from? So we go to the upper slope areas, drill, kind of basically figure out what are the areas where this excess water is coming from, and if we can identify those areas and get alfalfa established there to prevent excess water from moving down, then we're nipping it in the bud. And so, but again, it's taken 30 to 50 years for these saline areas, in many cases, to develop. At least some areas will develop in 10 or 15 years, but it takes time. But if you can identify the recharge area and get that established into alfalfa to prevent excess water from moving down to the groundwater, then you're going to be able to capture that water and prevent that water from moving downslope. And then over time, if you can seed salt-tolerant grasses in the discharge area, and so you get the salt-tolerant grasses established to kind of help use that water, lower that water table, and over time, those salts will move downward with just natural precipitation. If you have irrigation, that would help it. But you just want that, but it takes time for that to happen. Like you could be looking at 5 to 15 years. But I can remember I worked with a farmer. His name was Ron Staines in the Carmigate area back in the 80s, and the team was able to identify the recharge and discharge areas. And so he seeded all the recharge area to alfalfa and discharge area to grass. And within 15 years, the salts were gone, and he replaced the grasses with alfalfa even in the discharge area. Because the salts are mostly gone. And then by keeping alfalfa there, he's able to keep the water table down and actually be very productive. So just because you have weight doesn't mean the end of the world, but it's going to take some very good management over 10 to 20 years to reclaim that area. But it's certainly very possible. It's taken time for these areas to form and develop, and it takes a lot of time to reclaim them, but it's not the end of the world. With good management, you can get them back to being fairly productive again.
I guess part of the key then is identifying where the salts are coming from. And
that's right.
And unfortunately, there's a few companies out there, I think, that have the EM38s.
Yeah, some of the different precision management companies that do work with farmers to develop different soil crop management zones. Some of these companies do have EM38s, and then do have the ability to map the salinity. But in my mind, a lot of them don't do as good a job as what we used to do, because we would actually take soil samples, send them to the lab. They're representative of each field to know exactly what the salinity levels were, what the textures were, and then we would develop a good correlation between readings in that particular field with what the soil samples told us. We were able to develop more accurate maps. And some of the people now, they don't even bother taking soil samples. They just take the readings, develop a map, but you don't correlate it back to actual soil samples where you actually measure the electrical content.
Yeah, so the confidence of the information is a little bit less sure, you might say.
Exactly, and I certainly see that frequently. But they're helpful, but they're not as good or as reliable as what I would maybe like them to be.
Yeah, it's like any other tool. If you don't use it properly or with the other tools in your box, it can be somewhat misleading at times.
Yeah, quite right.
Yeah. So what about if, like, the salts aren't always that close, like the recharge area and the discharge area aren't always that close, are they?
Yeah, well, usually, they're often within a mile or two.
Okay, so pretty close.
So there's a number of different types of salinity, and in some cases, those salts might only be moving 1 or 2 kilometers. In some cases, like some of the coulee bottom salinity we might have in some of our old glacial meltwater tunnels, some of that water might be coming from 10 or 15 or 20 kilometers away. Well, then that's not within your realm of as a farmer to be able to control that. It has to be done on more of a regional basis. But for many farmers, if you have just localized salinity problems with, if you have 4 or 5 quarters together, you got a few spots of salinity. Sometimes just not quite on your own, you can kind of figure out with some topography and maps and EM38 maps, which map salinity, working with a good agronomist who's got a good soils background, you can get a pretty good idea where the recharge and discharge areas are, and then manage them on your own. But
so I'm kind of wondering, like I noticed this year it was quite dry in our county, not as dry as other places, but really, really noticed these saline patches and that they seem to be spreading.
Mm-hmm. And if you go back into the 50s and 60s, when we were still predominantly using the wheat fallow system, salinity was increasing in Alberta by about 10% a year. But by the 80s and 90s, we were shifting to more direct seeding, more continuous cropping, a lot less summer fallow. We have way less summer fallow now in southern and central Alberta than we did back in the 50s and 60s. So that's a real blessing, because that's where a good chunk of our water source was coming from to cause that salinity.
Right.
But we still have things developing, and we still have. I had a student when I used to teach part-time at university, a couple of courses at the University of Lethbridge, and one of them was a soils class. And we had a student when a student's or a project actually looked at air photos in the 80s, 90s, and then after 2000. And during that time period, he was still finding that salinity was spreading at about 5% per year, which is a concern. And when you have several very wet years followed by several dry years, that's when you really tend to notice it. You don't notice it so much in the wet years. That's when you have that excess moisture.
Yeah.
But when you have a few dry years in a row, like 2017, 18, and 19 were drier in southern and central Alberta than normal. 2000 was a little more normal, but then this past year, 2001, was very, very dry across most of southern and central Alberta. And when it's very dry, then the salts are more concentrated in the water, and then you see that negative effect, and you see the salts more visually as well. So it does tend to show up. You tend to see it more visually in drier years and wetter years.
Well, you think of it too, also thinner crops, and if salinity, maybe not the white crust, but the saline areas, as they try to encroach the cropping on it,
right?
They're already hard put to find enough moisture, so they're not going to really be using or growing as effectively as if it was no salinity there.
Right.
It's like strike two.
Yeah, and I should actually mention how there is a soil test we can use. So a farmer's concerned, like how much, how salty are some areas of the field. They can actually take soil samples, send to the lab, and they do what is called an EC, which stands for electrical conductivity. Mm-hmm. Really, all the lab does, they just take that soil sample, saturate it with water, let it sit overnight. Then they use a vacuum and a Buckner funnel, suck that with a vacuum. You suck that water out of the soil, measure the amount of electricity it'll conduct. The more electricity it conducts, the more salt you have in. Right. So the measurement is called decisiemens per meter. When no farmer cares what a decisiemens per meter is, I don't care either. But it's a lowercase d, capital S / M. That's the unit. But if you're less than 1, then your soil is perfectly normal. If you're between 1 and 2, well, I'm a little bit concerned. If you're between 2 and 4, then you have slight salinity, and that'll tend to, if you're in your surface soil, if you have an EC of between 2 and 3, that's going to maybe cause a reduction in wheat yield by 10 or 15%. Yeah. Not a lot, but enough that you're going to start to affect the crop.
At $14 a bushel, it's significant.
It becomes significant, exactly. And kind of between 2 and 6, we call that hidden salinity, because as you creep up from 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, the yield really starts to drop off, but there's no white on the soil surface. We don't see white on the soil surface until your EC is about 8 to 10. And so by
Wow.
the time you're up at 8 to 10, well, no crop, a crop is just simply isn't going to grow. But when you're between that 2 and 6, that's when the crop yields are declining, but it's hidden. And oftentimes some agronomists don't even really know how to recognize salinity, because really the way salinity works is that the plants need to be taking up water, but the concentration of the salt is so high, or it's getting higher in the water, that the soil actually pulls the water out of the plant roots, as opposed to the water being taken up from the soil into the plant roots. So then you really have kind of it really kind of looks like drought. The plant just can't take up enough water because of the excess salt in the soil.
It's like the old part of a poem, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You've got all kinds of water in the soil, but the plants can't take it up, which is ironic, but that's the way it is. No different than when we're out at the ocean and we want to have a glass of water, where you can't drink some water from the ocean. It's just too salty. It's not good for you. The same thing, same analogy with plants.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be an issue that we kind of know the solution, but it doesn't seem to be applied much. And it seems as we pursue greater and greater field efficiencies, we're taking out those plants that actually were managing the salts fairly well. I was thinking, how saline tolerant are some of the willow species? Do you know?
They'd be fairly tolerant, and they're fairly deep rooted and fairly tolerant, and they can take a certain amount of salt.
Yeah.
And
well, there's been a lot of sloughs taken out this year, or the last few years, a lot of bush around sloughs.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems when you have kind of rolling topography, the old glacial till forming or developed soils. You have these depressional areas that tend to be wetter. You take out the willows. Well, the willows are actually doing a good job of sucking up that water, keeping the water table down to prevent the salts from coming up. Take the willows out, then there's more opportunity for that water to move upwards, bringing salts with it, and it just gradually gets saltier and saltier over a 10-year period after you take the willows out. So farmers that do that, really in the long term, they're not doing themselves any favors, and they're doing more harm to the land than good. And sometimes you're well enough to, nature has its own way of kind of looking after itself, and in many ways are better to, on those low spots, leave them alone. They're actually healthy for the landscape, and don't take them out, leave them, and just learn to efficiently farm around them. And you're probably, in many cases, you're better off to do that.
Well, I was reading some research they did recently in County Camrose, where they'd had a vegetative buffer around a slough with pollinator species as well. And they were finding that within the first about 100 feet or so, 50 meters, there was actually elevated levels of canola due to the existence of those pollinator species like bees and some of the flies. So that there's a positive effect by leaving it too.
Yeah, oftentimes these areas can have much broader benefits than what we even realize. Absolutely.
But it seems our drive for field efficiencies and minimal amount of turning are driving us to bigger problems with salinity.
Right. Yeah, you gain efficiencies in one area, but then you're losing in another area. And when it comes to our soils, we really want to be managing them well. If we don't look after soils, then they're ultimately down the road, they're not going to be as productive. And the problem with salinity is if you mismanage, it's not like you see the problem the next year. It takes 10 years to develop the problem, or longer, and it's going to take many years to reclaim it as well.
Sort of long-term pain for short-term gain, you might say.
Exactly. Yep, quite right.
Yeah. Well, what crops, I guess, would be the most tolerant, and where are the tolerances, say, for the
right? The annual crop that we grow that is most tolerant is barley. That's the most tolerant crop we grow. 6-row barleys do tend to be maybe a little bit better than 2 rows. There used to be a lab at the Swift Current Research Station run by Dr. Harold Steffoon. He's long since retired, but he did some very good work in his lab, looking at even finding unique differences in with different barley types and different wheat types and different canola types. Some were more salt tolerant than others. And there has been a bit of interest in trying to look at developing new varieties that have a little bit more salinity tolerance. But I don't think there's been huge gains made, at least not on the Canadian prairies yet. But barley is the best, probably followed by wheat. Some of the new hybrid canola seem to have some good tolerance to salinity as well. But when I say tolerance, even at an EC of 4 or 5, they're not going to do very well, but they'll do better at an EC of 2 or 3. So, and then when you look at some of the other forage species, alfalfa seedlings are quite sensitive to salt. But if you can get alfalfa established, mature alfalfa plants are actually fairly, more tolerant. And so, if you have say EC level between 2 and 5, and you're worried about production, and with your annual crops, you might be better to take and put that area into alfalfa, get it well established. That alfalfa might actually turn out to be a more productive, a better paying crop than an annual crop if you have slight to moderate salinity. But once your salinity levels are up about 6 to 8 or higher, then you really have to go to a mixture of salt tolerant grasses. Some of the tall wheat grasses tend to be, but the more tolerant the grass, the salinity, the less palatable. And so that's one of the problems. You can get these other some of these salt tolerant grasses established, but they're not very palatable. You have to cut them pretty early to use for livestock feed.
Well, it's kind of like kochia, really, because kochia, they did research, probably 20 years ago or more, on forage use of kochia, and they found, yes, you could use it in a feed ration, but no more than about 15 to 20% because of the salinity.
Yeah, and you want to cut it fairly early too, while it's young, so it's more palatable. Absolutely. Yeah. And certainly when farmers see poorer growth, and when they see weeds like kochia or foxtail barley, those are two telltale weeds. If you see those, that's an indication that they tend to be more salt tolerant. You see these salt tolerant weeds growing, that's certainly an early indicator that you have a salinity problem developing. But a little bit poorer growth and the presence of salt tolerant weeds is definitely a clue. So you want to be doing some soil sampling to see what your salinity levels are in those poor areas. And if it is salinity, then you want to try and start to combat it and identify the recharge and discharge areas early before it gets to be a serious problem. But unfortunately, like I say, some agronomists aren't very good at even identifying those to be salinity. But it's the more proactive you are, the more the sooner you get on it, the sooner you get it managed and get it reclaimed.
Well, you brought up an interesting point with the foxtail barley, because that's one of the things I've heard over the years, that as we've moved towards conservation tillage, foxtail barley is becoming a very prevalent weed species out in the fields. And I'm thinking, well, it's not really that competitive. It's got those thin leaves. Usually it tends to take advantage of when there's gaps. So people should be maybe paying a little more attention to those foxtail barley areas and testing.
Yeah, and like you say, that it's not that competitive. It's short. It's not a pretty looking plant. It's relatively short, but in gaps where the crop's not doing quite as well, it's kind of been thin because of salinity. Then that's an opportunity for that more salt tolerant foxtail barley or kochia to grow. And so when you see it, that should be a red flag, should be going up. If you see kind of side slopes or low slopes in your field with higher predominance of kochia or foxtail barley, that's certainly an indicator that you've got a bit of a problem developing, and you want to try and nip it in the bud. Identify it and nip it in the bud as soon as you can.
Well, when you're paying the big buck for those cropping acres, sort of behooves you to pay attention to your fields and take care of what productive areas there are and try and improve it.
Yeah, and if you are working with an agronomist, like a precision management company that does mapping, certainly have those fields mapped, but with an EM38 or another machine that will do something similar. It's called a Veris machine. EM38 is a little easier because it doesn't actually penetrate the soil. You just drag it on the soil surface. But you can actually develop a fairly accurate map to show you, and when you're doing it, when you're doing the mapping of salinity, map the topography at the same time. So you can have a topography map with EM38 reading superimposed on it, which can be very helpful in identifying where those spots are. And typically they'll be in the lower leaf or side slope positions in the field typically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got a lot of very flat land around the Heisler area, but that's also where there's those solidized solanensis as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow. Is there anything I've missed about this?
No, I think we pretty much covered like to identify it using the soil samples and EM38 and taking soil samples and having those measured in the lab with determining EC, the electrical conductivity, how to measure it, then and then mapping it. Then once you've mapped it, you realize where those are. And if the salinity is not bad, well, and then maybe you just continue on with continuous cropping to make sure you're growing very good crops. But if there are areas that are deteriorating, you might want to consider putting alfalfa in the recharge areas where that excess water might be coming from, and then putting the salt tolerant grasses. Or if the salinity is not that bad, you could even maybe go with alfalfa even in the discharge area, as long as the salinity levels aren't too bad. But if they're over 6, you pretty much have to go with salt tolerant grasses.
Yeah.
Anyway, that in a nutshell pretty much covers it. There are a couple of good, used to be a couple of good AgDex publications on salinity on the Alberta Agriculture website. I'm not sure they're still there.
They're under open government.
Okay.
I found one that you'd written actually. Open.government.ab.ca, I think.
Yeah, so there's several on salinity, and I know I wrote one also on managing sodic soils, because there are some things there are. I should maybe mention that with sodic soils, which are the high sodium soils, you can use soil amendments like the one you can use would be gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, to displace the sodium to try and move it downward to improve the physical condition of a soil. So you can put on something called gypsum, but you really want to do that, to do it properly. You have to. There's some very careful measurements you have to take in terms of knowing what your sodium levels are, the exchangeable sodium levels, and the calculation you have to go through. And it's actually written, or that we actually put that in that application on how to go about figuring how much gypsum to put on per acre to reclaim this. I
thought gypsum was fairly insoluble, though.
It is. It's relatively insoluble, but it's the only thing you can really put on to kind of kick off that calcium. Use that calcium to kick off the sodium off the exchange complex. And it's a slow process, but it can be done somewhat effectively, but you want to do it with great caution. But with sodic soils, there is a product you can't put on. But with saline soils, there is nothing you can put on to help those to leach those salts down. Really, when it comes to soil salinity, it's a water problem. You've got a high water table, and you have to lower that water table. Now, I will mention that, particularly in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there's been a lot of interest in using subsurface tile drainage to help reclaim saline areas. And in fact, years ago, back in the 70s, I was the irrigation specialist in West before I moved into research, and I actually designed subsurface tile drainage for farmers, for irrigation farmers, and it worked really, really well. But I don't recommend it because not only are you have salts in that leachate water from the tile drainage system, you also have soluble herbicides and nitrates you're putting back into the surface water. So you're just causing you're just moving your environmental problem from one to another.
You still got the salt issue.
And so even though they work well, they will reclaim a saline soil, but then you're shifting a problem to create a surface water issue downstream for your neighbors, which I'm not a fan of. So there's really the best way to manage soil salinity in Alberta, in my opinion, is using cultural controls. You're using the salt tolerant grasses and alfalfa in the recharge and the grasses and discharge areas, and then just very wisely managing it. And then you're just working with nature to get things back under control.
Sounds like a good plan. It's unfortunately human nature is we want an instant solution, right?
Yeah, we want to buy something. Want to buy something and spray it on or spread it on and fix it right away. So.
And there's so many products out there.
Yeah, and to be honest, many years ago, I foolishly, when I was young, when I had brown hair, I mentioned, and there were several companies promoting these miracle products you put on saline soils and reclaim it. And I had talked to the local ag reporter and said, no, this is a pure unadulterated crap. I use more strong words than that.
Yeah.
But it wound up on the front page of the Lethbridge Herald, and I ended up getting sued for $700,000. And my director at the time with Alberta Agriculture said, McKenzie, keep your damn nose shut. That's not an exact quote. He used stronger words than that. But the reality is there's nothing you can put on saline soils and reclaim them no matter what.
So just be sensible about it, know your problem, and then use the appropriate tools to fix it.
Yeah, and if you could find a very experienced agronomist with salinity expertise, that's got a good soils background, that's really one of the things you want to look for. Someone who's got a very good, strong soils background, who's got soil chemistry, soil physics background, so you can understand the processes and help you with your reclamation plans.
They're a little thin on the ground, but
there's not many around, I'm afraid.
Nope.
That's the way it is. But anyway, I'm hopefully this has been useful. And if worst case comes to worst, if you have someone that's one of your farmers that is wanting and wants to chat, so you can always give them my name and number, and I'd be happy to.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ross.
And the price is right. I don't charge anything. But it also comes with a money back guarantee. So. Anyway, I'm always happy to share my past experiences.
Okay, thank you very much, Ross. I really appreciate this.
Well, it's been very nice chatting again. It's been good to visit with you.
Yes, thank you.
Good. Talk to you again.
Bye.